Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and welcome to the Classic Plus Corner. This is a segment of the channel where we discuss all things related to WoW Classic Plus. This will be episode 20, and today we'll be discussing heroic dungeons in Classic Plus. Do we want them? What does the community think? What are my thoughts? So this is another question that got posted on the Classic Plus project website, and we have polling results for it, and I found them to be quite interesting. It seems like if we take a quick look at the polls right here, around 40-some% it's a maybe, and then 42% is a yes. So there's only kind of like around 10%, and then there's around 2% that have no opinion, but there's 10% that are emphatically no. So it seems like people are pretty open to this idea. And I found that interesting because when you compare it to multiple difficulties, so things like kind of adding a heroic version for raids, or a mythic version or something like that, kind of like how Retail has. I think Retail has technically 4 versions. I think it's Raid Finder, Normal, Heroic, and then Mythic. But yeah, people are generally pretty against, adding any other difficulty to the raids. Maybe I'll talk about that in a different video. So what makes the dungeons different, right? And why do people really want this to begin with? And I think if we can kind of answer that, then maybe we'll get a better insight into what people are looking for, and we can kind of understand should they have a place in the game or not. So I think that the reason why people want heroic dungeons is because they have a very fond memory of TBC dungeons. And I think that this almost goes back a little bit to what we were talking about in a previous video about Classic Hardcore, where people do want to be challenged a little bit in this game now. They don't want to be challenged necessarily to the degree of Retail, I think. But in particular, when the challenge has very easy, accessible solutions, I think people are kind of up for it. What do I mean by that? So TBC heroics are interesting because they have a reputation, right, of being honestly probably some of the most difficult dungeon content outside of Mythic Plus, right? I think, until we got Mythic Plus, TBC heroics were probably the iteration of dungeons that were the hardest, right? I think it just kind of got easier from there. Maybe there's some specific dungeons in other versions of the game, but outside of that, I think that TBC was probably the hardest. And there's actually a video that I think I'm going to review pretty soon of somebody is making the argument that TBC heroics are actually better than Mythic Plus. They're a better implementation of the dungeon system, and we don't really even need Mythic Plus, and it was kind of like a mistake, I assume, is going to be the assumption that's being made. So I feel like that's really interesting. And I just bring it up because I think it highlights how kind of beloved these dungeons are. And I think a big part of, people really looking forward to TBC is kind of getting in those heroics and getting the gear. I honestly think that for some people, this is why the dungeon changes, like the Karazhan nerfs and things of that sort, were a bit disappointing for a lot of the player base. It's not just about the raid nerfs, but it's the fact that if you make the raids easier, the required amount of dungeon farming beforehand, kind of goes way down. A lot of people on the subreddit, we've had, I think, the raid out for like a day, Karazhan and the like, and Gruul and Magtheridon, and people are like, you can just walk into Karazhan with basically, your questing gear, maybe some normal dungeon stuff, and, even Nax gear if you had Nax gear. And you could do that a little bit in the original TBC as well, right? But there was a bit of a challenge to Karazhan. And what people are saying now is it's completely trivialized. You don't need any heroic gear at all. Not that you even ever maybe needed it, but it would at least be very helpful. And now it's like not even noticeable. People are basically saying it's not even worth getting, right? So yeah, I think that the TBC dungeons are so beloved that people are a bit annoyed that you can almost like bypass them now. And I think that realistically, the difficulty is just one part of the problem, or not part of the problem, but one part of the appeal. And it's really more about how you can deal with things in the dungeon. The stronger you are, the more mobs you can take on simultaneously. The weaker you are, you can use all sorts of CC. If you went on the subreddit, a couple days after launch, when people were starting to really get into heroics, you have some people that were like, oh, look at me, guys. We got this mob sap, this mob polymorphed, this mob maybe hexed. I don't know if Shaman has hex there, but you get the idea. They basically have a CC for every mob. This mob trapped. So you can really adjust the difficulty. I think that's actually a really cool thing about the Burning Crusade dungeons. It kind of does allow you, it kind of caters to all skill level. The bosses aren't insanely difficult. They have a distinct mechanic, right, that is somewhat punishing if you mess it up for the most part. So that's kind of novel, right? Because I feel like sometimes the classic bosses are a bit, it's not that they don't have any mechanics, right? But the mechanics sort of blend in with the fights. You can almost do some of the classic dungeon bosses and not even really understand what was going on in the fight. A great example, even one of the more difficult fights, I feel like, in classic era, which is Baron Rivendell. You can go into Baron's room and just kind of start zugging him down, and you notice the Mortal Strike, you notice the skeletons, but, assuming you deal with the adds fairly quickly, and your healer is, relatively competent enough to keep a tank up during the Mortal Strike, the fight doesn't really feel like super different. You feel like a little bit of ticking damage, but there's nobody has to really do anything. There's nothing really specific people are having to dodge or anything like that. So the fights are a lot less distinct, I feel like, in vanilla, and the mechanics are even simpler. So I feel like TBC, it really improved dungeons quite a bit, and people have this nostalgia for that. But the question I want to ask is, do we need dungeons to be like the heroic dungeons, or do we need them to even have a heroic version to kind of maintain those feelings, right? And for me, I think it's mostly no, right? Especially if we keep the implementation on dungeons similar to how it is in TBC, where you can kind of adjust your own difficulty like I was just talking about. People often, I think, like the idea of multiple difficulties because they think that's the way that you can adjust difficulty. That's the lever that people want to use, right? Hey, if you're a weaker player, you can stick to normal, and if you're a stronger player, you can go into heroic. This obviously, inevitably, it creates kind of some types of divides, I feel like, right, between the player base. Not only that, but I feel like this is a common consensus among players in general that if you do something and it's not the real version, it just doesn't feel so great, right? Like, let's just take, for example, people play games sometimes to get like a feeling of accomplishment, right? And, maybe a lot of people don't think of accomplishing a dungeon in a WoW Classic as an accomplishment, but there's some people that might, like some newer players, casual players, right? Feels good to kind of get through that dungeon, defeat the last boss, get some great loot. And if you're told like, oh, but that's not the real version, yeah, actually you did the noob version, as it turns out. Yeah, you're just kind of a noob, right? Yeah, there's a much harder version. Yeah, and it's kind of like intimidating. It almost makes it seem like it's invalidating your accomplishment a little bit. So there's kind of that aspect that I've always felt goes on with this thing where you make the difficulties, where you really partition them off. And, you can make the argument that, yeah, sure, if you go into a TBC heroic and you CC every other mob, then yeah, maybe the dungeon's not going to be that difficult. But realistically, nobody knows whether you did that or whether you pulled 3 mobs at a time or whatever, right? So as a player, you just have that feeling of I got it done, and I got it done on the hardest difficulty, and I got the best reward. I think that's really what matters at the end of the day. And what I'm kind of getting at here is I feel like this whole thing just makes normal dungeons obsolete. And I think you can look at TBC and even see that, because how many people are clamoring to run normal dungeons, right? Not many. If you're going to run any dungeon at all, you're probably going to run heroics, right? And you pretty much go into heroics very quickly. I mean, tanks maybe need some specific gear, right, in order to get defense capped and stuff like that. But for most other classes, for healers and DPS, you're kind of just getting to 70. You're getting maybe a mix mash of some of the stuff you got in dungeons, especially if you dungeon leveled, right? And then some crafted stuff, potentially some BOEs, some stuff you got while leveling, stuff maybe in Ring of Blood if you didn't have a good weapon before that. So you kind of get all these things, and it's kind of good enough to go into heroics for most classes. Like people are saying, it's probably good enough to go into Karazhan right now. So it's definitely good enough for most classes to go into heroics. Outside of maybe the tank has to do, like I said, a little bit of brushing up on their gear. So normals are almost completely invalidated, right? There's just kind of no point in having normal dungeons. I feel like if you add heroics to Classic Plus, you're kind of going to get the same thing. People are just kind of going to go into heroics right away. And the only way they could really fix that is if they, added, I would say, they made the dungeon so hard and so gear required, right? So you had like the tuning on the heroics so tight that you basically needed full normal gear. And then at that point, it would almost be like, okay, a Mythic Plus type situation, right? Where you're progressing through the normal dungeon to get gear for the heroic dungeon to then get gear for the raid. And, you could do that. That's one way you could do it. That would definitely extend the shelf life of the dungeon experience a little bit. But I think the problem there is that there's a reason why people tend to only do heroics and it works out, right? I don't think people would love it if that was how TPC worked. If you had to go into normals and do a bunch of normal dungeons and then be fully kitted out in normal dungeon gear before you could even attempt heroics, okay, and then you had to basically do the entire dungeons again, and maybe there's one novel mechanic, and maybe it's not even a novel mechanic in Classic Plus. Maybe they keep it like TPC, where I'm pretty sure it's just, the mobs hit harder and stuff like that. But even if you did add kind of like a novel mechanic, you're basically just reusing all the dungeons again. And I think people would start to accuse Blizzard of like, hey, you guys are just really artificially stretching out this content, right? You have, 8 dungeons or whatever you're launching Classic Plus with. And, basically you're trying to turn it into 16 dungeons when you really only have 8 because you're like, hey, you have to do these twice and you have to do the whole grind again, right? But you have to, do it on heroic this time. So I don't really know what the appeal is there for most players, right? And I think that if you just kind of got it right the first time, got the balance right the first time, it would be absolutely fine to just have one version of the dungeon. And the way I think you do that is you just make things probably a little bit harder than classic dungeons. But I don't really know that I want things to be exactly as hard as TBC dungeons, specifically the tank damage. As a healer, I'm a healer, right? So for me, it's kind of fun to have things get a bit spicy, get a bit hectic, right? But keep in mind that, healers in pretty much every version of the game are the lowest, I think tank is actually the one that has the fewest player count. But healer is not far behind that, right? And if you look at the Classic Plus survey that goes on the website, there's a bunch of people that are commenting on DPS. I think it was 40% is DPS, or maybe more actually. I think it was 70% or something. And it was 10% of the people that were replying are healers. I think there's some percentage that mentioned they were multi-class or something, but healers are endangered species. And, if you make things too hard off the bat, you're going to ward off all these people who, maybe would heal dungeons, but if you make it really hard, really stressful, now you're just going to have a way lower amount of healers than normal, and it's just not going to feel great at all, right? So my thoughts would be kind of tone down the tank damage a little bit, right? But keep some themes in the TBC dungeons going for the Classic Plus dungeon. So for example, the bosses being a little bit more involved than they are in Classic era. And this would be something that is not just pressure on the healers, right? It affects the entire 5-man. So I think that's fine. I think overloading pressure on one class or one role kind of never really feels good, especially like I said, when that role is already, maybe not the most played. So I think focusing on fleshing out boss mechanics a little bit, that's a lesson we could learn from TBC dungeons. I think giving the player the opportunity to use a bunch of different layers of crowd control if they so choose, that's something that's great, right? So we should probably keep that in the game. That lets players augment the difficulty themselves, so that's always good. It's almost like the scaling option for the raids that we were talking about in the prior video, where you can have the raid go all the way up to 40 people. It's just that you're getting less loot, right? In the case of the dungeon, you can have the dungeon basically take a lot longer, if you're going to CC every other mob, but you can get through it if you need to get through it like that. And it allows, all different types of players to experience it. And I feel like it also, the players that are going to be the type that are going to struggle in these dungeons anyway, it's probably because they're not super familiar with their class, right? And that's perfectly fine, everybody's new and has to start somewhere. But what it'll do is, getting them used to using CC and stuff like that, I think is really cool. It's hey, you can still do the dungeon, but you have to kind of learn where to use these crowd control abilities. And as they get better, maybe better geared or better play, they can reduce the amount of CC they're using. So I think that's a really great lever that they can use to kind of ease people into dungeons in Classic Plus. And I don't think you need to have a heroic version to do that. I think you can just have a normal version, have it a little bit of a step up from classic dungeons, maybe have the mobs hit a little bit harder, right? And flesh out the bosses a bit, and I think you're pretty good. Because honestly, classic dungeons are not really something that you can just kind of W key through right when you hit 60, in my opinion. Now, they're not quite as, slowed down, I would say, as like level 70 dungeons in that regard, right? But still, you're not like kind of going into Undead Strat for the first time and just, blindly walking through everything. And I think another thing that Classic Era does well, that TBC does well as well, and it should be continued to be thought of when we make dungeons for Classic Plus, is even the layouts of the dungeons are important, how the paths work. For example, a big thing in Undead Strat, one of the things that makes it quote-unquote difficult, I don't want to say it's like super difficult, but one of the things that makes it so you can't just breeze through it is the positioning of the mobs. Because, the fears can kind of send you into other packs. The packs are sort of close together. It's really easy for somebody that's not paying attention to back into mobs. Paths just kind of come from weird places sometimes. They can come from behind you. So having those elements, I think, is actually a great way to make the dungeon a bit harder. Kind of like awareness elements, right? That you can train yourself to over time, and don't just kind of single out like one class, or, they don't paint a picture where it's like, oh, this feels impossible. Because if you do like maybe if you're like a really noob healer and you try and do like Blood Furnace, right? And some of the pulls in Blood Furnace, or even like the Ramparts with the mobs that do a ton of damage, and the tank is just constantly going down, and you're just like, oh man, this feels impossible. Like, I don't even want to do this. It's so stressful. I just want to give up, right? Whereas if you have a situation where you're ambushed by a Pat in Undead Strat, that's something where you can be like, oh, I can learn from that, Now I know next time, pay attention to the Pat. So it's something that feels less impossible to kind of combat, because it's not like you're just being stat checked by the mobs. It feels like there's a legitimate actual counterplay to what you're doing in the dungeons. I think that's a great feeling. I think Classic executes on that really well. So yeah, basically I understand why everybody, probably thinks Heroic Dungeons for Classic Plus is a good idea. Do I think that if they added Heroic Dungeons to Classic Plus that it would ruin the game? Of course not, It's something they could do. I don't think it would be terrible. But I think if they do, it's mostly just going to be kind of like a redundant thing. And, I think that they might have problems balancing it at first, because I think especially if they get into that mindset of like, we want the heroic dungeons in here, then it kind of does create this situation where they're probably going to try and live up, to those fabled TBC heroic dungeons. And like I said, I think that that's a little bit too hard, We want to cater to new players as well. We want this to be a big game, right, guys? And I think for the most part, people aren't looking for insane difficulty or challenge. They want a moderate challenge. They want something that can kind of be overcome through strategical means, like, again, using the CC, I think, is a perfect example of that, rather than, just somebody being maybe an excellent gamer at their class, right? They don't want people to have to be a class aficionado to navigate through one of these dungeons without a wipe. So that's my thoughts. I think they could work in Classic Plus, but I just don't think they're necessary. And I think the game would be a lot better if you just had that version of the dungeon. I think you could kind of remove normals from TBC, or you could almost have a version that's sort of like Heroics, where once you hit max level, then the dungeons can kind of be repurposed. I think that's one of the nice things about Heroics, is that it kind of gives the leveling dungeons another purpose that's not there normally. So normally in something like Vanilla Classic, if you do a ZF, which is kind of like a really beloved dungeon, it's great, but you outscale the gear relatively quickly, and it's pretty useless at 60, right? So having some type of mechanic where you can do the dungeon again at level 60 for better gear, or maybe even like different gear, I think that's fine. They could even potentially add some mechanics to the mob. So if you want to go that route, and that's what you mean by heroic dungeons, then I totally understand that. And I think some people are probably thinking that way, because when you look at the responses, again, the first response is maybe depends on how they implement them, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a one-to-one TBC implementation. So if you're going to do something like that, that's great, because it reuses some of the leveling content, And, what's wrong with that, right? I think it just makes it easier on them to develop, gives more content for the players, because you're not really having to build out entire new dungeons, but you can get new items from them. That's always really exciting. So I think something like that would be fantastic. But having this like upper echelon of difficulty that's like super hard and meant to be sort of gatekeepy, I don't think that would go over well for a lot of the player base. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think. If you like videos like this, a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you next time. See ya.